Let's just get everyone in, and they're going to be coming in as they come in. Everyone in, having more people coming in. Right, okay, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, folks. Welcome to another Islamic Courses session. This one is titled Book Review Discussion, Sectarianization, the New Politics of the Middle East. We're very honored and privileged to have the author, Dr. Nader Hashemi, who's the director of the Center of Middle East Studies, University of Denver, and it's hosted by Nasim Ahmed from the Middle East Monitor and Quartet 21. So just a quick reminder to everyone, keep your devices on mute or silent. It is being recorded and you will get a copy straight after this. If you're not on our registered email list, leave your email on the chat. There is a Q&A session as well. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Nader, but welcome Dr. Nader and Nasim. Assalamu alaikum.
Welcome, Salam. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Hello and welcome. Thanks, Mizan, for this nice invitation. My name is, you'll know, is Nasim. I am a writer and a political analyst at the Middle East Monitor. Let me introduce Dr. Nader. He's a professor, associate professor at the Middle East and Islamic Politics and director of the Center of Middle East Studies at Joseph Corbett School of International Studies. He's got a number of previous books, but I would like to mention this particular one, Islam, Secularism, and Liberal Democracy towards a Democratic Theory of Muslim Societies. Broadly, the theme of Dr. Nader's work is a collision, if you want to call it that, between Islam and modernity and how the role of Islam is negotiated within modernity. The book we'll be reviewing is his latest volume, which he edited with Danny Postel, which is this one, Sectarianization, Mapping the New Politics of the Middle East. Dr. Nader, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
No, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to be with people who are, thinking about these issues at a deep level. I'm happy to make a contribution.
Yes, and thank you for putting together this wonderful collection of essays. I think it's an immensely important contribution to understanding of sectarian violence and why it has exploded in the Middle East over the past few decades. But before we get to that, besides teaching, are you working on any projects right now that we should be looking forward to?
I'm working on several projects. I have a multi-volume sort of collection, an edited volume of the best writings on the topic of Islam and human rights. This is for a series at Routledge Press, where they ask people to collect the most influential writings on a particular topic and write an introduction to that collection. So this is roughly, it's going to be a 4-volume reference guide that collects the best essays, book excerpts, and contributions to the broad study of Islam and human rights. So that's currently in the works. And then I have a bigger project. I'm going on sabbatical next year, and I'm looking at a new project that deals with the question of the global effects of authoritarianism, of political authoritarianism in the Middle East. How this is a problem that not only has destroyed and corrupted the polities and societies of the Middle East, but I'm going to make an argument how the problem of political authoritarianism has now gone global. And I'm hoping to, begin work on that project sometime in September and turn it into a book project.
It sounds like quite a natural transition from the book we'll be reviewing today, speaking about authoritarianism. You do smash a lot of myths about sectarian violence in your book. I think a good point to start our conversation would be for you to first define what you mean by sectarianization in contradistinction to sectarianism.
Yeah.
Lay out the sectarianization thesis for us and tell us why the narrative, which most of us are familiar with, of primordial conflict between Sunnis and Shias is incorrect as an explanation for the rise of sectarian violence within the Middle East.
Yeah, well, what we try to do in the book, both in the introduction and in the various case studies, is to challenge the very intellectually lazy and Orientalist reliance on the term sectarianism as sort of a catch-all explanation for the ills afflicting the Middle East today. I've kept a very long and detailed record of people in the public domain, people who are journalists, public intellectuals, not really scholars of the Middle East, who repeatedly sort of just throw around the phrase that, look, these Sunnis and Shias have been fighting for thousands of years. There's nothing that we can do. That's just who they are. We have to simply try and manage it. In fact, one of the biggest proponents of the thesis of alleged enduring sectarian conflict in the Middle East between Sunnis and Shias was none other than Barack Obama himself, who repeatedly used the phrase ancient sectarian differences to explain the conflict and turmoil in the Middle East today. In one of his interviews, he said that sectarian identities are the only organizing principle in the Middle East. And so, you know, what we try to do in the book is challenge that claim. Obviously, there's been an intensity in sectarian conflict between Muslim groups in recent years, but the question is why? Why has there been an upsurge in sectarian conflict? And so we propose the thesis, and we coined the term sectarianization as an active process that is actually shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve the mobilization of populations around particular identity markers. In this case, you know, Sunni and Shia identity markers. We acknowledge that sectarianization also involves class dynamics, fragile states, and geopolitical rivalries. But the term sectarianism, which we try to distinguish ourselves with by coining the term sectarianization, sectarianism, which is often bandied about, sort of is devoid of these reference points. It tends to imply sort of a static given, that there has always been deep sectarian conflict in the Muslim world, going back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad. It sort of acts as a trans-historical force, and there's nothing you can do about it. So central to our argument on sectarianization is the theme of political authoritarianism. It's central to the sectarianization thesis. And of course, this form of political rule has long dominated the politics of the Middle East, and it's produced a corrosive legacy that has corrupted the politics and societies of the region and produced incentives by political actors to play the sectarian card as a way of obtaining political power and perpetuating political power. So the argument of the book is that authoritarianism, not theology, is the critical factor in the sectarianization process. Authoritarian regimes, we argue, have deliberately, in different ways, manipulated sectarian identities as a strategy of deflecting criticism and demands for political change to other Muslim groups in the hope of perpetuating political power. And so this anti-democratic political context is actually absolutely essential for understanding sectarian conflict in the Muslim world today. In a nutshell, you know, the argument that we make is that it's about politics, not necessarily piety. Of course, piety plays into it in terms of the mobilization, but the driving force behind the upsurge in sectarian conflict are really political questions. And that gives you some hope, because if the problems are political, then it suggests there are solutions that can be negotiated, that we're not stuck in this you know, sectarian vortex. I do want to mention, though, very clearly that we don't adopt the position that is somewhat romanticized and that ignores history and that assumes that Sunnis and Shias have always gotten along and things were wonderful until these authoritarian leaders arrived. No, there always have been tensions. There always have been, myths and, ideas that have been bandied about other groups, other Muslim groups that have perpetuated this. But, the argument that we make very clearly in the introduction is that actually sectarian conflict has a history. And if you want to understand it, you got to know the history. These arguments that we hear from prominent politicians and some public intellectuals about, thousands of years of conflict between Sunnis and Shias is just factually unsustainable.
Thank you for that. We'll unpack some of those points during the conversation. And if you want to find out how the idea of a primordial conflict between Sunnis and Shias is so entrenched and deep within society, I think in the introduction, you provide a number of examples. Obama is just one of many, many countless of intellectuals and public figures who subscribe to that idea. But the obvious question I think many would ask is, because there's a link, as you alluded to, between authoritarianism and the rise of sectarianism. But many would ask, why the Middle East is more prone to sectarian violence. Authoritarian regimes exist in other parts of the world, Latin America. We can name a number of countries. But why is violence and sectarianism so stubborn in the Middle East?
Well, it's only stubborn if you have a sense of history. So it's important to point out that this alleged stubbornness of sectarian conflict goes back roughly 40 years. The key event is 1979. And of course, if you know your history, that was when the Iranian Revolution took place, that toppled a pro-Western dictatorship, and it shocked and it frightened other pro-Western authoritarian regimes in the region, who were fearful that this revolutionary wave of Islamist politics would come across the Persian Gulf and directly undermine the stability of other authoritarian regimes and governments in the Muslim world. So that's when it begins. I don't think that the Middle East is more prone to sectarian conflict than other parts of the world. I mean, how long did the conflict, which was sectarian, in Ireland last? Other parts of the world have experienced this type of, group dynamic conflict, whether it's sectarian or whether it's ethnic. If you know your history, the Balkans, and particularly the breakup of Yugoslavia, was deeply shaped by this type of conflict. So I don't think there's anything unique and enduring about the Middle East when it comes to this form of conflict. I think the problem, as I sort of alluded to, is that you can't understand sectarian conflict today in the Middle East unless you understand and appreciate the centrality of authoritarianism. And unfortunately, political authoritarianism is deeply entrenched in the politics of the region. The Arab Spring tried to sort of shake that stranglehold. And that's why you also see, and that's the argument that we partially make in the book, that you do see an upsurge in sectarian conflict after the Arab Spring, because regimes that were in power, fearing the loss of power, play the sectarian card. Saudi Arabia does it. Perhaps the best example of this is in Syria, where Bashar al-Assad's brutal regime right from the beginning tries to spin the conflict in Syria, not as a conflict about democracy and human rights and ending the rule of one family now in power for roughly half a century, but they tried and spin it as a conflict that is sectarian in nature, that's driven by Al-Qaeda. And unfortunately, that narrative, catches on, particularly in the Western world, and particularly as a result of, the unfolding of this conflict, which does, by year 2, take on certain sectarian dimensions. But that was deliberately a policy of the Assad regime to play the sectarian card in various ways that are brilliantly, I think, discussed in the chapter on Syria. And so that's why you see, that's another key turning point. If you understand, the history of this, the post 2011 is absolutely essential for understanding the rise of sectarianism in the Middle East, because that's when authoritarian regimes were shaken by the pro-democracy revolts that were taking place. So in answer to your question, I don't think there's anything deeply rooted here.
Oh, yeah. Well, with the Syria issue, I think we will get to Syria, I think, more within the context of the geopolitical relationship between sectarianization. I think we can get to that. But then let's unpack the definition a bit more and look at sectarianism as a kind of and its functional similarities with other forms of identity. I mean, would it be fair to compare the more universal ethnic political mobilization we see in other parts of the world, say, for example, now more prominently recently in the US with Trump and Black Lives Matter and America First, where we are really seeing a kind of an identity cultural war and identity politics seeping into politics in ways we've never seen before. So, and the rise of extreme far-right groups in Europe as well. So what I'm trying to say basically is that politicians and elites in general are taking advantage of whatever social cleavages exist to boost their electoral chances. So functionally, is there similarity between what's happening in the Middle East and other parts of the world, which we're witnessing right now?
Yes, absolutely there is. When we define sort of the theory of sectarianization, we draw upon the theories of ethnic conflict to try and explain it. It's basically, group conflict, people mobilized around particular identity markers, whether they're, religious sects in the case of Sunni Shia conflict, or whether they're ethnic groups, or whether they're racial groups. So you mentioned the United States. I think it's a perfect example. I mean, Donald Trump basically comes to power by mobilizing white Americans around a narrative that all of these identity groups in the United States, whether they're African American or Hispanic or other sort of minority groups, have corrupted the United States, and they've taken away your jobs, and they're destroying what was once great about the United States. So effectively, you can understand the rise of Donald Trump as his deliberate and largely successful attempt of mobilizing many white people around a narrative of white disenfranchisement, white sort of discrimination at the expense of, in favor of other groups who are allegedly, stealing from the national treasury, who are benefiting from this system. And you can't understand the rise of, this type of, racial conflict that we're seeing in the United States today, unless you focus on the, activities of political leaders. Donald Trump played this card every time he had the opportunity. Last summer, he played the law and order sort of theme as a way of, mobilizing people around his particular narrative. So yes, broadly speaking, in terms of the functionality, I think, of these types of dynamics, you can understand sectarian conflict in the Middle East today through the prism of other group conflict that has taken place, whether it's racial or ethnic. The dynamics are broadly the same. The behavior of political actors are broadly the same. Of course, there's a lot more going on, right? There's underlying conditions that contribute to this type of mobilization, often rooted in economic disparity, in the loss of hope. Also, in the case of, outside influences that come in. In the case of the Middle East, sectarian conflict is deeply influenced by what's happening in other parts of the Islamic world that often feed into and exacerbate a sectarian conflict. That also applies to, I think what's happening with Donald Trump and the rise of white nationalism. There was an attempt, and there still is a project of trying to mobilize people around the world around the themes of Donald Trump's campaign. And you see this, certain solidarity that he has with other right-wing populist leaders in Europe, thus playing this mutually reinforcing effect that I alluded to.
I mean, the strongest relationship I saw in reading the book is just how the rise of ethnic sectarianism is really related to autocracy, and more autocratic regimes, also autocrats rise around the world. We see a tendency of a rise in sectarian politics, and that's very strong, and it comes out in your book. But one thing you didn't include in your book is the case of Egypt. I mean, of course, you provide, the first part is theoretical aspects of sectarianization. Then you provide, I think, 7 or 8 different examples, case studies. But Egypt isn't one of the countries. Some may be surprised by that. I mean, would it be fair, though, to say that autocrats in Cairo, Sisi, for example, have deployed the tactics of sectarianization by pitting Islamist and secularist to stabilize the regime? And more broadly, you know, looking at Egypt, could the historical rift between Islamist and secularist be seen through the lens of sectarianization?
Yeah, I think that would be fair. I think that's a fair comparison. In this case, it would be the mobilization of people around certain ideological identities, whether it be Islamist, and then a sort of, you know, anti-Islamist sort of. In Egypt, they're called secular liberals, but I don't think they're very liberal in their actual politics. But yes, I think that dynamic broadly does apply to the case of Egypt. The reason why we didn't include Egypt in the book is because we focus on Sunni Shia conflict, and that's not part of the contemporary reality of Egypt. There are there's, as far as I can tell, very little Sunni Shia conflict there. The Egyptian government in the past has tried to sort of play the card of Shia proselytizing, and this has been picked up by some leading Sunni ulama, but you know, no one takes that seriously. So that's why we didn't include Egypt in the book. But I think your framing of what's taking place in Egypt today, particularly post-Arab Spring, was very much, you know, along the lines of how we describe the sectarianization process, the mobilization of sort of groups around particular identity markers with the goal of perpetuating political power and shifting attention away from the failed policies of ruling elites and focusing them on the activities of these, you know, sub-state actors who allegedly are responsible for tearing down the nation state.
Yeah, you've alluded to 1979, and I think one of the strong arguments in your book for the rise of sectarianization is the question of why now? Just Islam, Sunnis and Shias have been around, as you mentioned, for 1,400 years almost. So the exponential rise in sectarian conflict, it correlates with the rise of nation states within the Middle East. That comes out quite clearly in your book, but unpack that for us. You know, why 1978 is a critical moment, and why have states mobilized sectarianism as part of their toolkit and arsenal, and why in particular weak states, because many of the countries in the Middle East are weak states. Weak states rely on sectarianization to stay in power.
So 1979 is a key turning point in the politics of the Muslim world, the politics of the Middle East, because of the Iranian Revolution, which was a revolution that took place not on sectarian terms. In fact, right up until today, the official line that comes out of Tehran is that their revolution and their vision for the future of the Muslim world is non-sectarian. They want Muslims of different sectarian backgrounds to unite together to challenge imperialism, Zionism, etc. But what happens after 79, fearing this populist revolutionary wave coming out of Iran, is that Saudi Arabia and many of the Gulf states then play the sectarian card as a way of diminishing the appeal of revolutionary Islamism and trying to present the Iranian Revolution as a decidedly sectarian project that no good thinking, upstanding Muslim should be engaged with, that this has nothing to do with Islam. The Saudi narrative was that, look, you know, if you're a good Sunni Muslim, you have to be deferent to, you have to pay deference to, you know, political authority, not challenge it, because the worst thing that can happen is anarchy. This is a longstanding sort of theme in the history of Islamic politics. So they played that narrative, and they basically let loose using Saudi petrodollars a campaign that involved senior clerical leaders in Saudi Arabia to perpetuate these stereotypes, these myths, this demonization of Shia Muslims and Shia Islam. and that gets spread around the world because of the influence of the spread of Saudi foreign policy through the use of oil sales and through the spread of Wahhabism. So just to give you one example, I was shocked the first time I landed in Malaysia. This was in 2014. And when I got off the plane, one of the big issues in Malaysia was that there was a lot of sectarian conflict between Sunnis and Shia in Malaysia. And it sort of shocked me because the last time I checked, there weren't a lot of Shia Muslims to begin with in Malaysia. But long story short is that Malaysia has received a lot of Saudi money. There's been a lot of, intellectual exchanges, scholarships that have been provided to imams in Malaysia. They go to Saudi Arabia, they come back and they spread this type of, hysteria when there's really not a problem to begin with, because the number of Shia Muslims in Malaysia is infinitesimal. But you wouldn't know that given the hysteria and the sort of agitation that you hear from some prominent, Muslim organizations in Malaysia. So this is basically what happened. This was a strategy fundamentally driven by pro-Western authoritarian regimes in the Arab and Islamic world to stay in power, because they deeply feared this wave of revolutionary political Islam coming out of Iran. Over time, it sinks roots. I think the policies of the Islamic Republic of Iran have actually played into the Saudi narrative, particularly after 2011, when Iran got deeply involved in the conflict in Syria, which was a propaganda victory, I think, for its critics, portraying the conflict in Syria as an attempt by Iran to impose its Shia hegemony over the country by backing Bashar al-Assad. So this is basically the backstory. It goes back to 1979. Prior to 1979, and throughout most of the modern history of the Middle East, when new nation states were emerged, you don't see sectarian conflict. In fact, Sunnis and Shias, were very much on the same side of the struggle against colonialism and imperialism and for national independence. You begin to see an uptake after 1979, largely driven by the regional rivalry and the policies of Saudi Arabia and its allies, and Iran and its allies on the other side.
I think Vali Nasser's piece on Pakistan, I think, really highlights this in a way which I think it probably best highlights this of all the pieces here. I am conscious of time, and because I know you have to go exactly at 6 p.m. UK time. So I'll probably just ask a few more questions before we move on to Q&A. We spoke about the geopolitical dimension, and we saw this being played out in a really brutal and horrific way in Syria. How significant has the geopolitical dimension been? So I'm talking about the US, Russia, but generally, tell us a bit about how geopolitics has exacerbated sectarianization within the Middle East.
I think it's been a key driving factor. So you have sort of local national contexts where this dynamic plays out, but these national contexts, of course, don't exist in a vacuum, right? There are regional power games being played by regional powers, primarily Saudi Arabia and Iran, using the sectarianization sort of thesis in different ways, but fundamentally for the same goal of expanding regional influence, perpetuating the rule of ruling elites. And so this plays itself out most catastrophically in the case of Syria, where, almost 10 years ago to this day, the Arab Spring arrives in Syria, and it's, at least for the first 6 to 8 months, overwhelmingly a non-sectarian conflict, a peaceful conflict, a conflict that is focusing on the common demands in other Arab countries that produced revolts, democracy, dignity, self-determination, etc. But of course, Iran gets involved for its own geostrategic reasons. It views the loss of Syria as being a major loss to its regional influence in the region, largely because of its ability to access its primary ally in the Middle East, Hezbollah. And so it invests heavily in trying to crush the Syrian uprising. Saudi Arabia sees an opportunity to advance its position. And so Saudi Arabia and the GCC countries, the other Gulf states, also start to fund various militias in Syria, hoping that they will be the victor of this particular conflict when it's all said and done, and that Iran's position will be diminished. So there's a lot of money that is poured in that fundamentally radicalizes and militarizes the conflict in Syria and produces, just a catastrophic situation. In fact, creates the social conditions for the rise of ISIS, which emerges in 2014, benefiting from the chaos and the mayhem that this and the violence that this conflict has produced. So the conflict in Syria has its local, dimension, which is where the uprising begins. It becomes regionalized. Regional powers, including Turkey, also intervene, trying to advance their regional position. And then there's the international dimension as well. And the international dimension can be described as largely the United States on the one hand, rhetorically claiming it supports the overthrow of Bashar al-Assad, but sympathizing with its allies in the region, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Qatar, who intervene. And Obama has no interest in getting involved in Syria in any substantial way. He looks to Syria and he sees Iraq and he doesn't want to go there. So they basically give a free hand to their allies to do what they want in Syria, which just raises the level of violence and chaos. The international dimension is also played out at the UN Security Council, where the United States and its allies and Russia and China on the other side, basically paralyzed the UN Security Council to do anything of substance that could bring this conflict to an end. So you have that international dimension, you have the regional dimension, and then you have the local dimension. And sadly, for the people of Syria, it's the local dimension that has largely been forgotten. Bashar al-Assad's narrative that, look, this is a sectarian conflict, and if you don't support us, it's going to get much worse. That idea has largely been accepted in many Western capitals. And now, there's basically just complete and total Syria fatigue. No one wants to think about Syria, do anything about Syria. They're just happy that, it's over, even though the tragedy of Syria is that the key actor who is responsible for the vast majority of violence, including the systematic use of chemical weapons, remains in his palace in Damascus after all of this bloodshed and mayhem. So that's Syria in a nutshell.
Thanks for that. As you said, you do need to leave at 6 o'clock, so I want to give our guests a chance to ask you questions. I do have a number of other questions in mind, but I want to park them for now and see how the discussion develops. So I'll hand over to Mizan to coordinate the Q&A with the other guests.
Thank you so much. Excellent interview. Right, we've got a lot of comments and questions, so we've got to really go with them quickly. We're going to go with Dr. Sabah and Mukhtar first. Dr. Sabah. I've just unmuted you.
He needs to probably unmute himself.
He needs to unmute himself.
How are you going to tell him?
Hello, can you hear me?
No, yes, go ahead, Sheikh.
Assalamu alaikum, brothers. I'm slightly at a disadvantage because I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book. So I'm going to start from the vacuum. I have slight problems with the premise that the Sunni Shia fight goes back thousands of years. Because at the end of the day, whether you look at Shia as a sect, that's the Ja'fari sect, or you look at it as a sect which is generally speaking Iranian. The Shiites are, by the numbers, they represent something like, I don't know, 5, 7, 10% of the Muslims in the world. So to start by labelizing all the conflicts as if they are based on Shia Sunni, whether it was the time of the crime which was committed against Imam Hussein, or the subsequent failures in the Abbasid and Umayyad period, as Shia Sunni conflict. I don't think they are. We have a problem with the labelizing issues. For instance, we've just heard, for instance, that Syria is really, or Assad is saying that the conflict they have there is a sectarian one. On the contrary, Syria says there is nothing to do with sectarian because they don't admit that they are of a different sect. They're talking about the agenda which the West use, which is the ISIS. So it says, if you let us fall, then you're going to end up with ISIS. The second issue is this idea of attaching the responsibility to the division between the Shiites and the Sunnis on anything, on any conflict, which is not too dissimilar if here in the UK, when we have conflict between the football clubs, some of them are blue and some of them are red, we either blame it on the color or blame it on the football itself, which is not necessarily correct. The conflicts that existed in the Middle East, whether between the Arabs and the Israelis, or whether it's between the Arabs and the Kurds, or the Turks and the Kurds, because the biggest problem Turkey has is not Shia Sunni. The problem they have is the Kurdish problem. So to try and lump all of these things, I find it a little bit questionable in terms of the analogy which we are talking about, especially that we are talking about sectarization in terms of the Shiite Sunni rather than the conflict basis, whether it's on, as it was mentioned a number of times, either because of the governments or lack of justice. Or I think most of the conflicts, whether we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, whether we look at the Hezbollah, whether we look at ISIS, whether we look at the Kurdish movement, they are generally speaking people uprising against the injustices they see, regardless of the government. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, Sabah, we're in full agreement. I think you'll benefit from reading the book because that's very much what we argue, that these are fundamentally political conflicts driven by ruling elites. They have political solutions. As I said in my introductory remarks, I'm not sure if you heard them, but fundamentally the problem that we try to explain that's known as sectarian conflict. These are fundamentally problems of politics, not of piety. And so that sort of suggests that there's some opportunity to resolve them. In fact, the introduction to the book we go out of our way to debunk and to challenge this ridiculous claim of ancient sectarian hatreds between Sunnis and Shia. That's just not historically, that's not factually sustainable. It's a gross distortion, but sadly, many people believe it, and many people believe it largely because it's an easy way of sort of explaining what's going on. It doesn't demand any sort of deeper understanding of what's happening. You just sort of fall back on these popular myths and stereotypes about the region, that these people are just backward. So someone like, that we quote in the book, someone like Thomas Friedman, who's a prominent foreign affairs analyst, claims that the root of the conflict in Yemen today can be traced back to the 7th century over who should succeed the Prophet Muhammad, Sunnis or Shias. I mean, I'm quoting him, that's what he says. And this stuff gets sort of accepted by many people. Of course, many people who don't know what they're talking about, right? Because thankfully in academia and in peer-reviewed journals, those types of arguments would not stand up to critical scrutiny. But sadly, in the policy discussion and in the popular sort of representation and discussion of the Middle East, these types of ridiculous claims about alleged ancient sectarian hatreds are very much accepted, including, and then they're perpetuated by people like Barack Obama, who, I think did it for other reasons, for policy reasons. So I think we're in broad agreement.
We've got Professor Iftikhar Malik. I've just unmuted you.
Assalamu alaikum. So nice to see you, Nader. I don't know whether you remember me. You visited us when you were in Oxford in the early 1990s. But I'm looking forward to reading your book. My position is between what you have been suggesting and what Sabah just mentioned. I think in the history, there are case studies where Shia-Sunni problem did flare up. For example, when you look at the Ismaili connection in the Indus Valley, and Mahmud Ghaznavi attacked that region, and lots of Ismailis were dislocated and killed. And then if you look at the Safavid, empire, this is where Persia becomes predominantly Shias and Sunnis have to leave. And there's quite a bit of intolerance, Shah Abbas, Ismail. So we know that. And when you look at Central Asia, for example, predominantly Sunni, and when Turkoman, get involved in enslavement, mostly they are enslaving people from Persia who happen to be, Shia. So I think at one level that is a historical burden. Reasons could be 120. Sabah is saying they're 5 or 6%. No, I mean, like in Pakistan, 15 to 20%, Pakistanis are Shia, which makes them more in number than the total number of population, maybe in Arab Iraq. And so it's a fair number of people. And then if maybe, partly you're right, Nader, that it is something to do with modernity. But, I'm suggesting that things did happen in the past. For example, the first English book by an English author on Shia Islam was done by a lady, Biddy Timms, because this is my next book, which is coming out with Rutledge, and I did some study of Biddy Timms. She's known as Mrs. Ali, and she married an Indian Muslim from Awadh, from Lucknow, here in Britain in 1811 or 1812, and then they left for Lucknow, Awadh, in 1816. So she lived there for 12 years with this Shia family, which was a Sayyid family, very respectable family, very close to the Nawabs. And she saw how Shia Islam was being sort of formalized in Awadh. You remember in India, in the subcontinent, Awadh was the center of Shia Islam after the death of Aurangzeb. And all these Nawabs, they created Imambaras, they created Karbalas, they created Najaf, and it remains, a very strong center of Shia Islam. But in all her 600-page long book, the first book on Shia Islam, in English, and especially in India by a British author, she's very favorable to Islam, and she's married to a Muslim, and then she comes back to Britain and teaches it. She doesn't talk about Shia-Sunni conflict. So at one level you could say, but after that, same Lucknow, same Faizabad, same Farrukhabad, they sadly, become centers of Shia-Sunni conflicts, and especially during Muharram. And then when you come to Khilafat movement, it's amazing that people like Aga Khan, who was the leader of Ismaili Muslim, and then Sayyid Amir Ali, one of the great scholars of Islam and the first historian of Islam in English, living it, they go all the way to Mustafa Kemal in Turkey to ask him not to demolish or abolish Khilafat, which was basically a Sunni institution. So what I'm suggesting is that it is not a clear-cut situation. At one level, we have to accept the fact that there are these doctrinal differences. Sometimes they became very hostile, like Ibn Taymiyyah and some of these great scholars were very anti-Shia. And I'm sure amongst Shias, there have been theologians who had their reservations and criticism of Sunni. So at one level, I think we have this historical burden, but at another level, I do accept your point that modernity, nation-state system, they intensify the sectarian differences. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah, thank you, Iftikhar, for those comments. I think we're in broad agreement. I don't think it was me who was in Oxford in the late 1990s. Maybe it was someone who looked like me, but I welcome your arguments. They overlap with a lot of what I've argued, and very much you stated the thesis very well. We have a chapter in the book by a very good scholar of the Middle East, Osama Makdisi, who makes a very similar argument that the rise of these types of sectarian conflicts is a function of modernity, the rise of the nation states, the ruling elites that want to stay in power. And absolutely, yes, there are these doctrinal differences in historical sort of memories that are manipulated in modern context as a way of mobilizing people. We do not take the position in the book of some sort of romanticized coexistence between Sunnis and Shias and everything was wonderful until modernity arrived or until colonialism arrived or until authoritarianism arrived. That's not our argument. There is historical baggage. But the question that we pose in the book is why now? Why is it at this particular moment, in the 21st century, that we've seen a significant uptake in conflict and tension and not in other periods? As I said a moment ago, the modern history of the Muslim world, 19th and into the 20th century sees very little Sunni-Shia conflict until 1979. And one reason for that has to do with the answer that I gave about the Iranian Revolution and the Saudi response to the Iranian Revolution. And critically, I don't think you can understand this topic, particularly in South Asia. We have a very good chapter that was alluded to in the book by Vali Nas, which talks about the case of Pakistan. You can't understand the upsurge in Sunni-Shia conflict unless you understand the role of Wahhabi Islam and the attempt to sort of spread this type of, defamation of other Muslims as a way of extending Saudi soft power to other parts of the Muslim world. This is foundational, it's central, and it plays upon historical themes, absolutely. So there's a lot to say there. I'm glad you're working on this. I think there's a huge gap in terms of understanding what's happening on this particular topic in terms of the history and the contemporary politics of South Asia. It sounds like you've done some preliminary work, so I look forward to your intellectual contributions to this thesis.
Thank you. We've got Zalan. Zalan, just have unmuted you.
Oh, yes. Thank you for that. I've two and a half quick questions. One was basically about sort of your opinion on recent actions of our cooling off between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the relationship because of what was seen as a Pakistan's slant towards Iran. And also what it says about the decline of the nation states in terms of how sectarian identities have now become transnational. And then the last one was sort of was just a general point about, are there any examples of successful de-sectarianizing or case studies of de-sectarianizing sort of situations where we managed to wind things down from this level of violence and extremism that's building? Thank you.
Well, great questions. I haven't followed the Saudi-Pakistani rift, but clearly what's happening is, Pakistan is in deep financial crisis, and it's relying on Saudi Arabia to bail itself out of its financial crisis. That explains why a couple of years ago, when the notorious Saudi crown prince Mohammed bin Salman went to Pakistan, they rolled out the red carpet for him. Right? They shut down everything, and they were hoping that Saudi Arabia would bail Pakistan out. So when Pakistan pushes back a little bit and it doesn't do what Saudi Arabia wants, it produces tensions. I think that's very much the quid pro quo here that MBS, the Saudi crown prince, was hoping. We'll give you the financial resources, and we expect you to follow our foreign policy line. But of course, Pakistan has its own, border with Iran and its own relationship and its own national interests. So it can't simply be the puppet of Saudi Arabia that the Saudi crown prince would want it to be. I think that probably broadly explains the tension. You're on very good ground in terms of talking about the decline of the nation state. I think the collapse of states, as we've seen in the Middle East, that contain Sunni Shia populations, contribute to sectarianism. In Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria, when states collapse and people no longer have a strong commitment to a broad sense of nationalism, Iraqiness, Syrianness, being a Yemeni citizen, they fall back on more local identities, more provincial identities, more parochial identities for safety and security. One of the dynamics that are happening in a broken Iraq today is you have effectively these massive patronage systems that often revolve around, sectarian identity commitments and cleavages that, keep people in power and that, sustain people economically. So very much the decline and the collapse of nation states and the inability of people to primarily identify with being a member of a nation state has produced a dynamic largely for reasons of survival, where people then fall back for security and economic possibility and opportunity on these more local and provincialized identities. And so that in many ways leads to the third question, de-sectarianization. You can't de-sectarianize, I think, these conflicts unless there is significant change in terms of the enveloping context. We identify authoritarian politics as being the key context that explains the rise of sectarianization. If that's the problem, then the solution to the problem of sectarian conflict is the converse of authoritarianism. That's democratization, that's more open societies, that's a political system that removes the incentive from politicians to engage in this type of identity mobilization, and critically allows for, cross or horizontal community building, solidarity building of people from different sectarian groups. This is, I think, one of the keys to de-sectarianization, to shifting politics away from sort of a top-down set of politics and policies, and allowing for horizontal community building, community engagement that can start to mitigate, and also critically, public information. Unless you can sort of challenge the sectarian narrative of a dominant authoritarian power, saying that your politics and your policies and your references about this other group is fundamentally, misguided, unethical, and does not stand up to critical scrutiny. Unless you can do that without fearing persecution, arrest, imprisonment, then you can't have, a changing political culture that can help to start diminish these types of tensions and conflicts. So, democratization is absolutely crucial. And the last thing I'd say about de-sectarianization, the challenge of Sunni Shia coexistence is not that different from other types of group, other challenges that involves other groups in terms of how do you coexist in the same political community in peace, in harmony, and with dignity. That's the big question. How do we coexist with other people despite their differences? And the challenge is basically, I think, the challenge of good legal procedures, good constitutional arrangements that allows for everyone a seat at the table, to have their rights respected and protected. And then, you proceed from that premise. So in many ways, the challenges that we're seeing right now in the Middle East with respect to sectarian conflict is not that different from how other communities that had plural identities, they had to face the same question: how can we coexist with one another despite our differences? And the answer, broadly speaking, is through a process of democratization, constitutional building, good legal systems that are just not, written in law, but are actually enforced in terms of the practical implementation and the practical sort of functioning of everyday life.
We got a comment from Nasreen and a question. What a treat to hear from an expert and scholar of this topic. Couldn't agree more. What is your prediction for the future vis-a-vis Abraham Accords, Israel in CENTCOM, Iran nuclear deal with the P5+1 and other drivers?
Too many questions there to answer
got
all
more
of them.
Questions coming through, but
yeah. On the Abraham Accords, take a look at my website. I wrote in October of last year a 5,000-word essay on the Abraham Accords. It's a critical examination of the topic. So I don't want to say anything more about that. You can just read it there and make your own evaluation. On the question of the P5+1, Iran-US tensions, I'm a bit more optimistic, significantly more optimistic now that Trump is out of office. But things are moving very slowly. I think there's a lot going on here. The Trump administration is dragging its feet. I think it's hoping that it can get Iran to compromise the longer it keeps the Trump-era sanctions in place. So there's a deep reluctance on the part of the Biden administration to jump back onto a deal with Iran. And then there's internal Iranian politics. One of the things that's happening that most people might not know about is now there are internal sort of Iranian disincentives from getting on and signing back onto the nuclear deal. And that has to do with factional politics in Iran. Hardliners know that a revival of the Iran nuclear agreement will lead to major lifting of sanctions and then economic prosperity. And they want to reap the political rewards that go with that. They don't want to give the Rouhani government that type of boost in the lead up to presidential elections. And I put elections in quotes because elections in Iran are not free, they're not fair. But they do matter. They do sometimes make a difference. So that's another dynamic that I think is in play here, internal factional politics in Iran that is inhibiting a quick return to the agreement. But I think fundamentally there's no way out, both for the United States and Iran, unless there's some sort of revival of the nuclear agreement. And the good thing about it is that at least the Biden team, in contrast to the Trump team, is at least formally committed to reviving the Iran nuclear agreement. And I think that's good for the people of Iran fundamentally, because they've paid the biggest price here, not the ruling elites. They really haven't been affected in Iran by the sanctions. And I think that opens the door a revival of the nuclear agreement, in other words, opens the door for democratization and for popular organization and mobilization. And that's why when the nuclear agreement was signed in 2015, every single prominent pro-democracy voice, reformist voice, in prison, out of prison, supported the nuclear deal because they felt that it would open the pathway to democratization, or at least create better internal social conditions for Iranians to challenge their own authoritarian regime.
Thank you. We'll take the final question because we've only got about 5 minutes left. Ashif Akram, very quickly, please.
Yeah. So my question, since I have only a few minutes, so just a very naive question: what's actually the Middle East doctrine in terms of there are some power centers, for example, in Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, for example, and they are trying to kind of fight out inside this whole Middle East board game, and the recent closeness of United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia to Israel, security infrastructure, that they're very afraid that Israel and the US have to be always pleased by them, or have to be in their good books. What's their end game? What is the final outcome they want from all these fights and their geopolitical stance?
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, each country in the region is trying to advance its own national interests. And when we say that, we have to be clear. The national interests of these different countries in the Middle East is really the national interests of the ruling elites in power, not of the people. We always have to make that distinction. So Turkey is trying to advance its interests, as is Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, etc. I think there's three broad alliances that one can sort of see, somewhat loose alliances that are shaping the politics of the Middle East today. There is, as you correctly alluded to, there's basically the Saudi Gulf states Israel alliance backed by the United States. I like to refer to that alliance as the axis of Arab autocracies, now in alliance with Israel, trying to shape politics in their own vision, very much focused on the role of Iran in the region. But fundamentally, I think this axis of Arab autocracy and Israel, their biggest fear is less Iran and its regional democratization. I make this argument in the essay that I referred to, that I wrote on the Abraham Accords. You can read more about it. So that's one axis. The other axis is basically Iran and its allies. It's Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, Shia militias in Iraq that form one sort of axis within the Middle East that are trying to advance their interests. And then Turkey and Qatar are sort of the third axis or alliance that exists. They have their own visions. They are in conflict primarily with the Saudi Israeli sort of alliance. And so Turkey has its own sort of, regional ambitions. Primarily, it's focused on preventing the rise of Kurdish independence and autonomy. That's the primary focus for Turkey. But Turkey also, under Erdogan, aspires to be the leader of the Islamic world, and puts a lot of emphasis, rhetorically at least, in defending oppressed Muslims, defending the Palestinians, but critically not defending what I think is the worst human rights crisis on the planet today, and that is the genocide against the Uyghurs. Turkey has been very silent on that, revealingly so, because they want Chinese investment, and they look to China as a particular ally. So there's not a lot to admire here. All of them are authoritarian regimes, and one of the things that I love to do on social media is to mock the policies of these authoritarian leaders, because I think they should be mocked. But I put a lot of hope and emphasis in what's happening in society, right, in the struggles for democracy, for human rights, for self-determination among the Palestinians. I think that's where the real hope lies. It doesn't lie in any of these authoritarian regimes. Some are worse than others, but there's none there that I really admire.
Fantastic. We're going to come to that. I'm going to hand over to Nasim, but what I wanted to say, thank you so much. It's been a fantastic session, but maybe I want to invite you back and how we're going to move forward. Can we build a coexistent society post-modernity and post-empire? Because a lot of our coexistence really worked as we had the gunpowder empires for 500 years or so, and the last 100 years we've been struggling with nationalism and postmodernity. Now, the question is, maybe for another session, we'll come back yourself with other panelists as well. Can we get our tribes, our different religious and sectarian differences, as well as different religiouses, ethnicity, and build a theology or a postmodern theology or a postmodern narrative in building, beyond just in a modern way? Because the constitutionalism relies on having a democratic state, and a lot of people in these Muslim countries are struggling with that idea because they haven't seen any benefits anyway. And now they're looking at the US and thinking, haha, we told you so, you see. But over to Nasim. Thank you so much, Dr. Nader.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mizan. I mean, I don't really want to add much other than to say, I highly recommend the book. It really does deepen our understanding of the sectarianization process, and really the link between sectarianism and or authoritarian regimes. I mean, one line in the book I thought was really amazing, which is that authoritarian states, they actually draw life from ethnic and religious violence, and I thought that was quite a striking sentence. And I applaud Nader for writing the book, and like you said, hopefully we can have another conversation. And thank you, Nader, for taking your time. I know you have to rush off.
I do, but before I go, I just want to applaud what you guys are doing. I mean, one of my big frustrations with the state of Muslim societies, the Muslim world, is the absence of open forums where we can have these types of debates and discussions. So I'm very impressed by what you guys have done. Happy to make another contribution.
Inshallah.
Keep up the good work. And
thank you so much,
go.
Dr. Nader. Take care. Wassalam. And
Salam.
folks out there, if you want to receive a link, we'll send you the link. Otherwise, take care. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.